last we have a true star here at Rancho Mirage, Mo Rocca.
Oh, please. It does feel so star-studded around here. It's like the Golden Globes. People are, yeah.
It's the glitter from the Golden Globes. But the weather has been amazing since we've been here. We're so glad to have Mo here. And Roctogenarians, or Roctogenarians, I should say, is his new book that we're going to talk about. And it is so much fun and so interesting. And what he does, we all know you, Mo, from CBS Sunday Morning now, many other incantations in your life we don't have to deal with.
My rap sheet.
Yeah, your rap sheet. But you make a great argument here, or a fun argument, that today with proper health care in the 80s or 70s can be the new beginning of a life. And a lot of moments in history, people weren't known until they invented something or thought of something or wrote a book or a song score, a painting later in life.
Right.
And I'm going to pick up with the number of characters in here. The first one that interested me is Colonel Sanders, because I used to eat his chicken all the time. Yeah. What's the backstory to him?
Well, the Colonel Sanders, my co-author John Greenberg and I wanted to start with Colonel Sanders because I think we all have, at least at one point in our lives, liked KFC. I think it's not at a good place right now. Hopefully they'll improve. But it's just such a great story that, Harlan Sanders was this man living in rural Kentucky, living his life. He had this Shell gas station / chicken and biscuits joint. He was doing fine in the 1950s, and then a highway cut through an interstate, and it bypassed the town of Corbin, Kentucky. So the bottom fell out of his business. He sold it at auction at a loss, and he was 66 years old at that point, subsisting on Social Security, which was then $105 a month. And he could have continued living like that. He had this hard-scrabble life. He had, lost his parents early and supported his siblings. At one point, he was a midwife. He had done all these different things. But he instead girded himself. He got in a car with 2 pressure cookers and a bucket of that secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices. And he drove town to town cooking for people. And, sort of on spec, if they didn't like what the recipe, they didn't have to pay anything. And within 8 years, he was the face of this Kentucky Fried empire of 800 outlets worldwide. And I think we love that story because just the act of getting in that car and moving forward, driving forward, he didn't really have much choice in the matter, but that sort of future-oriented and present-minded kind of attitude I found really inspiring.
Did you eat Kentucky Fried Chicken growing up?
Not much. We ate more McDonald's, which was not a great idea either. So we weren't a big KFC family. But I think that the sandwich is actually pretty good. It's not as good as the Popeyes one. But the point is that Colonel Sanders looked great while he was driving across the country. He was that honorary colonel even before then, actually, and had created this whole persona. And then he, spoke at a House hearing on the Hill about the importance of working late into life. But yeah, and I think that act of getting in that car and driving, it's also a great scene for the biopic, a montage eventually, if they make it into a movie, right? Just driving town to town. But this is a person who just wasn't going to look back. I mean, quite literally.
Did you ever discover what was so special about the recipes, or they try to keep that
Well, it is secret, Doug.
Yes.
And so I would get sued if I disclosed what it is.
Did you dig in at all? Did you say, were you curious, or just said,
I am
not
sort of
worth
curious.
wasting time going there?
I am sort of curious. There's probably some oregano in there. I mean, that's at least one of the 11, I would guess. We could probably figure it out. So.
In the art world, tell us about Matisse.
Well,
in a chapter.
Henri Matisse, so there are certain themes, connections among these people who, and just to be blunt here, a Roctogenarian is defined as somebody who does not accept the conventional wisdom that the last third of your life is a time for sort of clocking out or winding things down, right? And we all know that ageism is wrong. It's also just really stupid because there's all this amazing human capital, and like it or not, the population is aging, and to put people out to pasture, it is not only wrong, it's just counterproductive and bad for society.
Do you like that idea of a third act? People will say, I think Bill McKibben, the climatologist, talks about the third act, activism, and get your later part in your life.
Yeah, well, let me just, in general, say that, I mean, look, old people are my jam. I just want to be clear about that. I love working on CBS Sunday Morning, and I had a cooking show where I went around the country for 4 seasons cooking with grandmothers and grandfathers in their kitchens. And what I found, it's a generality, is that the older you get, in general, the less you care about what other people think of you.
Yeah.
And God, how I hope to get there. And so it leaves you sort of unfettered and like free to act. And so it's not a coincidence that it was really easy to fill this book with people who just were unshackled at that point in their lives. You asked about Matisse. One of the things that connects a lot of these people is that they viewed endings as beginnings. So Matisse was already a really widely hailed modernist by the time he was in his early 70s. But it was at that point that cancer robbed him of the ability to paint. Stomach cancer, he could no longer sit upright. He had to be either reclined in a wheelchair or in a bed. And instinctively, he traded in his paintbrush for a giant pair of scissors. And he just began cutting out giant shapes from colored paper and having assistants help pin them against the wall in his home in the south of France. And this epoch of his, right, the paper cutouts, alone would have made him a legendary, world-famous artist. And he described it as a second childhood. And this I found so poignant. He viewed it as something childlike, not childish, but childlike, dealing with big shapes and bright colors, a return to a lack of complicatedness that you have as a child, which is also another thread that runs through this, kind of a return to kind of the simplified, unfettered thinking that you might have had as a child when you were more creative. Obviously, he had spent his life as a great artist, so it was much more significant at that point. This is, as I say, is a way of looking at an ending as a new beginning, that he embarked on this whole new career, but he would later say that it was his favorite part of his career because of that lack of complicatedness, and I found that beautiful.
And at that time, he started getting adopted by jazz artists and things because of some of that too, so he suddenly was back into a new modern art movement because of it in that last act.
Absolutely, and friends like Picasso showed up and visited him and expected to find somebody enfeebled and depressed, and they found him just with a joyful attitude and inspired. And he ended up doing the stained glass windows for a chapel not far from where he lived, and he was not a religious man, but viewed this as a deeply spiritual experience.
You deal with...
He ended strong.
Yeah, he ended very strong. Auden, W.H. Auden ended very strong. Some people think Auden's last poetry was his best poetry.
Is that right?
Yeah. Let me ask you about Estella Getty, because we just saw when the fires were in L.A., and for a moment I saw the Getty, like it's getting near the Getty Art Museum. Right. And Ed Ruscha, the great painter, did this Los Angeles County Museum on fire years ago about the danger of the beautiful building near there. And it made me reflect a little on the villa along, Malibu there and the Getty Museum, but just the Getty family and Estella Getty. Tell me about it.
Well, first of all, Estelle Getty, who played Sophia in The Golden Girls, right, the mother. You cannot I think it would be illegal to have done a book like this and not include at least one Golden Girl. I mean, right? Okay. And of the 4, I love them all, but she was the one to do. Because the other 3 had really vibrant careers all their lives. Betty White, B. Arthur, and Rue McClanahan. Let me just also say that one of the great things about those four women is, people think of sort of TV and film in one bucket and theater in another, but a sitcom before a live audience is much more of a theatrical experience. And those ladies knew how to milk a laugh, how to work an audience. I mean, they were real masters. Betty White had not had a theatrical career, but she had worked in radio for a long time before live audiences. But Estelle Getty is somebody who made her television debut at the age of 62. And it's just a great story. It's not like she happened to late in life be discovered. She wanted this from the beginning. From a working class family in the Lower East Side of New York, as a kid, the father would take them to the Academy of Music to watch vaudeville acts. She waited tables in the Catskills, but she ended up marrying early in her 20s. She had 2 sons. She was dedicated to her family. And she did whatever she could to work in the theater. And it wasn't easy while she was raising her family. She said she played every kind of mother: Italian mothers, Irish mothers, Jewish mothers, the mother to everyone except Attila the Hun, she once said. Which is kind of cute, like the Hun, would it be Attila the Hun? But Hun, like H-O-N. Anyway, and so, but she did something that I think is so important for people later in life to realize, which is when her kids went off to college, she finally had more time to dedicate herself to her pursuit. She hadn't given it up. This was already when she was in her 50s. And she went to see a play by a then unknown playwright named Harvey Fierstein. And the play was a 1-act called International Stud. And she saw it and she liked the play. And then this is what she did that I think is so great. She went backstage. She's unknown. And she introduced herself to the playwright and she said, "Write me a part." And he was so taken aback by this chutzpah that he ended up doing it. And the play he wrote for her, the part he wrote for her, became the 3rd act of what would be Torch Song Trilogy. And so she was a sensation in that. And then she was discovered. It went to LA. And then she ended up being cast on The Golden Girls and made this debut at the age of 62. And it's weird to put it this way, but it just feels so deserved because she had lived such a good life and on so many levels, and was rewarded with this part that is arguably one of the funniest parts in the last 40 years on network television. And she killed it.
Absolutely. Did you notice when you're doing your writing and research that people that escape the perils of alcohol and drugs abuse can end up having a 3rd act that's more vivid and exciting than people that are hindered with addiction? Or can you overcome it and have a 3rd act?
It's such a great question. I'm trying to think through these stories of people. I mean, there certainly are people in the book who escaped abusive childhoods. Ruth Slenczynska, who is a great concert pianist, who I profiled for CBS Sunday Morning at the age of 87 when she had a new album come out. She's now 100. She had been the Shirley Temple of classical music. I mean, she subbed for Rachmaninoff when she was 9 years old. And like that Rachmaninoff, like it's crazy. And so, not like, George Rachmaninoff. And she still had around her neck this little Fabergé egg that he'd given her, and the pendant. But she had a father, a Polish violinist father, who'd been injured during World War I, and took out his frustrations on her. She wasn't literally not allowed to play with dolls or with other kids, and so she understandably gave up the piano when she was in her teens. And then, then she came back to it because she needed to survive. And she told me that you only become a real pianist after the age of 60, because the notes may be the same, but the story you tell is different. But what I found really poignant and gripping was that her longest lasting relationship in life has been with the piano. And it was a tortured, kind of ugly relationship at first, but she managed to come out of that with the love of the man she eventually married, and make peace with the piano. And now it's her longest lasting, deepest relationship.
You know, the Wynton Marsalis, who does the theme song for CBS Sunday Morning on the great jazz trumpet player, Jazz at Lincoln Center, he once said, when you get older and more accomplished as a musician, talking about the piano, that it's not just the white keys and the black keys, but the real greats learn the silent space in between better. You're not, when you're young, you're trying to play, you show up, but then later it's that pause. That you actually can become a better pianist as you get older because of that, or anything but the horn, because the lips get so swollen from
right, the embouchure,
yeah.
right. But you're making me think, right, that I should be pausing more to show you how wise I am.
Yeah, and you did it.
I do think I look better now than I did like 10 years ago. I think my hair looks great, and that came with age.
They agree. You've got.
Well, I asked for it.
Yeah, I know you did.
For it.
You know, yet when I mentioned drugs, alcohol, I was trying to give you a softball of Willie Nelson,
Yes,
who's now touring in his 90s and plays guitar brilliantly, and fans adore his shows. It's not like seeing a has-been. How does Willie Nelson, you think, able to continue to perform so frequently in his 90s?
Well, I think that what Willie Nelson did, which is something that George Carlin did and Richard Pryor did, you well know that Willie Nelson early in his career, with the suit and tie, clean shaven, writing great songs like Patsy Cline's Crazy, eventually realized this is not exactly me and I need to be who I am. He grew his hair out. Now this happened much earlier in life, but I think it was a new lease on life for him. And he clearly loves performing. I think he still, as of last year, was doing something like over 100 dates a year. Is it true also, I know you know a lot about Willie Nelson, that his favorite singer is Sinatra?
Yes, and Sinatra is he just did a couple of albums of, Willie pulls off doing Sinatra. Bob Dylan not as well. They tried, but Willie really pulls it off. But I remember. You came out here once. We've known each other for a while, but you came out here once to talk with Nancy Sinatra.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, first of all,
gears,
she was great. It was on the occasion of Sinatra's what would have been his 100th birthday, and so I came to visit with Nancy Sinatra. And what was so great is in the middle of it, Gavin MacLeod walked into that place. I don't know if anyone knew him here. He was just so he was so friendly. It was so great, and he was so great on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and then on the Love Boat and all of that. And then I also talked to Tina and to Frank Jr. who's no longer with us. But they were all, their love for their father was so beautiful. I mean, Nancy especially, I think, had a really deep bond with her father. But Frank Jr. gave us probably the most insightful bite, and I didn't realize it at the time. He said he was comparing Bing Crosby, who Sinatra loved, with Sinatra. And he said, when Bing sang, you believed him. When Frank sang, you believed him. And at the moment, I remember thinking, you just repeated yourself. And then I watched it back on tape, and I saw what he meant, that Sinatra really lived those lyrics.
And did Nancy, did you go to that concert? I forget, did you get to see the 100th birthday?
I didn't. I watched it on TV, and I thought Lady Gaga was great. She did something, I remember, she sang New York, New York, but she did what I think some of the other singers weren't able to do, which is pay homage to him, but also make it her own, which is something I think that Frank would have wanted.
You know, Mo,
can I tell you one other thing that Nancy said that I thought was so interesting? She said, she had been in a movie with Elvis Presley, and then she had met Marilyn Monroe once. And I think this is the thing about her father, that there's certain people, when they walk into a room, certain stars, that it's almost like the frequency in the room. You don't even have to see, it's from behind. It goes, and he said, like with Elvis and with Marilyn, it was that way. And with her father, she knew him differently, but I could be standing over there, he could walk in behind from across the room, and you'd go, wait, something's just happened. There's something about that charisma.
Oh man, there's no question about it. But it made me think. I've never really talked to you about your mom, but I know she's been she was from Colombia, correct?
Yeah, from Latin America.
Latin America, and then How has your mom fit into your lifescape, and how does your mom deal with her
age,
aging, or third act?
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you how old my mother is because she'd kill me. So I'll just say that she's 4 years shy of a very big birthday with 3 digits. And so my mother is like, my mother lives in the 19th century, which I love. So she's very old-fashioned, and she lives above me in the same apartment building where my family lives. She's a few floors up. And in the process of writing this book, she came and she said, "Will you write about me?" And at first I thought, she's not serious, but she's so private. And then a couple weeks later, she said, "Are you going to write about me?" And I went, "Okay." So I did that thing that we're all supposed to do, but many of us drag our feet on, which is I interviewed my mother. And I wanted to know, understand, and I think that my mother asked me to do this because I think she wanted to leave something behind. I have a 6-month-old daughter, and I think that may be part of it. But I think also she wanted to believe, and she's right, that her story is worth telling. I think we all want to, I think some of us may need to be convinced of that, but I think it's really important, and this comes up with Frank McCourt. And to me, there's nothing little that's sadder than somebody that goes to their grave not believing that their story is worth telling. So there was something in that request from my mother that she said, would you include me in the book? And it was very out of character for her. And so I interviewed her, and in the course of it, my mother, I think, began to piece together how significant her own life was. When she was 3 months old, her father from Colombia, with this dream of the American dream, packed up the family and moved them from Bogota to New York City. Their timing couldn't have been worse. It was the fall of 1928. And so the next year with the stock market crash, they lost everything. Then they had 5 mouths to feed. They had to go back, lowest class on the boat, to Colombia. And I think of it as the most humiliating reverse commute ever, to have to leave and go back to the country that you came from. I mean, just so heartbreaking. Her father was a dour, gloomy man for the rest of his life. And then my mother, as a young woman, came to the United States alone, not speaking a lick of English. And she was heartsick. Her mother said, come back, come back. But something made her say, I'm going to stay, and I'm going to learn English. She met my father. They built a small business together, raised 3 sons. And in the course of writing this, really with her, I said, don't you understand, Ma? You were able to do what your father was not able to do. And you were able to come here, and you were able, to succeed. And I don't think she really realized it. I don't think she had made that very significant macro connection.
Did you get a tape? Do you tape her and then give her a transcript, or she just knows what she told you?
I taped some of what she said, and then I took notes, and I will tell you, that she had full approval.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Did she have that?
Like, this is my mother. Like, this is not. Yeah, took the journalist hat off. Like, this is authorized.
In your book, I think one of the most interesting ones that I never really thought about, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie. Do you guys remember the book? And she wrote like 6, a series of books. Tell me about her and what she was in her 67. Tell us about her journey and how that came to be.
I loved those books growing up, the 8 books of the Little House series and the TV series. They were great. And she, I did not realize how difficult her life after those early prairie years were. I mean, she and her husband, Almanzo, I hate the pronunciation, but that's really how you're supposed to pronounce it. On the TV show, it's Almanzo, which is much more pleasing to the ear. But anyway, it was really Almanzo. They went from state to state, sometimes chased by creditors. They ended up in the Ozarks of Missouri. They had 1 daughter, a controversial figure, Rose Wilder. She had to go to school without shoes during the 1930s. But she told her mother, she gave her an incredibly valuable piece of advice. She said, your story, you lived this epic American life. You were there for the transition from frontiersmen to pioneers to farmers to the small town to the closing of the frontier in 1890. You saw this. You need to tell your story. And Laura, who had begun writing a domestic life column for something called the Missouri Ruralist, said, as we were saying before, said, I don't know that my story is worth telling. I don't know how to do this. And Rose, her daughter, said, write as if you're writing in a diary. And it was such an amazing piece of advice. And what came out were the Little House books. I mean, it took a while because at first she wrote something that was much more adult, and a great editor at Knopf said, no, do this as a children's book. And children's book franchises were unheard of then. And when this editor on a train ride from New York City to Westport, Connecticut, read the first draft of the first book, she was transported to the prairie by this woman who had only been published before for a domestic life column. And she was 65 when the first of those 8 books came out. But
and that's shocking because you always think maybe she wrote them when she was younger.
Yeah. I love them. And can I just
was it the TV show that made you love them? Do you think?
Yeah, I love the TV show. One of the things I noticed about the TV show is, actually, I'm going to bring up my mother again, is my mother, even though English was her second language, she was riveted to the TV show. And I know that the show I profiled Melissa Gilbert, and during the pandemic, ratings really spiked on Little House on the Prairie reruns. Because I think people wanted that kind of comfort and those very basic foundational themes. But globally, it's really, really popular. It resonates with people all over the world. So I just kind of loved it. I also like the idea that if you had a fever, that the best thing to do was to be put into a tub of ice. I mean, I didn't want that to happen to me because it looked like I don't like when water's too cold. Yeah. But I just loved the drama of it. And you never knew who would go blind.
Yeah.
So.
And it had the theme song. Talk about the amazing
the
theme
song. Da 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 da, and then falling down, right? Through that prairie grass was written by David Rose, who I believe was one of Judy Garland's 5 husbands, and also wrote the music for The Stripper. Da, 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 da. But Walnut Grove did not have a strip club.
I have a CBS story very briefly with that. Walter Cronkite had met him, and Walter was worried that people were seeing him as being too, the guy on TV, Mr. Serious, breaking news, da-da-da. And so at parties, he had learned from Rose how to properly do the striptease to that music. And Walter would go down to his underwear at a party.
Walter Cronkite?
Yes, Walter Cronkite.
Would you a strip?
I'm his biographer. I'm telling you this as the truth.
This is great. Wait.
Yeah.
What?
It was, he would do it, Cronkite, just so people were disarmed. Like, oh my God, he can make fun of himself. He's not full of himself. But he had learned like how to do it with the music. Later.
And would he have gloves on to do one finger at a time?
He didn't do the gloves. He wasn't coming in drag to parties or anything like that. He simply would have a few drinks and then shock people with this little routine he had mastered, and it broke the house down. I think he learned it at some of the old boys clubs. It won people over. So it became his trick pony that he'd unleash places. Yeah.
God, I wish they'd use that music for the evening news to end each night. Wait, and can I just tell you what I was just talking about Walter Cronkite yesterday, who I might have met for a split second, but I was once in this crazy room. It was a Viacom upfront, an advertiser's thing, and they had me go there because I was doing stuff on VH1, and I walked into this room, and it was insane. Fleetwood Mac was there, Dolly Parton, Paul Newman, Walter Cronkite, and I was just kind of couldn't believe what I was seeing. But it was one of those worlds collide thing because Walter Cronkite was over by was over by the craft services, and he was eating a corn muffin. I just remember was eating a corn muffin, and Dolly Parton walked in, and she was behind him, and she went, "Walter!" And he turned around with the corn muffin, and he went, "Dolly!" and the corn muffin just sort of crumbled everywhere, and they embraced, and I went, wow, Dolly Parton and Walter Cronkite are on a hugging basis. But they're both amazing, and so of course they would hug each other. And the corn muffin went everywhere.
One of the ones that interested me, but it's not, you mentioned Ezra Pound, you write a little bit about. I don't know, how many people know who Ezra Pound was? Great poet, cantos, one of the greats, but was considered a pro-fascist in Italy and then ended up in St. Elizabeth's. But I once went to his home in Idaho, where he's born. Hemingway moved up there to be, like, see where the great Ezra Pound. Did you see, as Pound gets, is there an ability as a poet or something, do you think, like Pound, to get crazier as you get older?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, he's in a section of the book on people who really screwed it up at the end.
Yeah.
Because we needed to have at least a couple of pages on people who really should have just, like, do no harm. Just, like, don't do anything. Like Rudy Giuliani, after the mayoralty, just, like, go to a monastery. Like, and so we included Ezra Pound, who became a raging anti-Semite. John Tyler, our 10th president, who ended up, he was not a bad president, John Tyler. I mean, he's the guy who follows William Henry Harrison, who forgot to wear a hat and died after 30 days, because of dying. But then John Tyler ended up running for the Confederate Congress. I'm like, wah, wah. Like, he really way to choose the wrong side. And Giuliani is there, and Bill Spector. But so they're in a sort of a gallery of people who just like, oh my God, your third act, you should not have had one.
Which begs the question, how does one know when they to cool their jets too? I mean, when do you say, hey, I got to get out of the game? It used to be like a 65 retirement.
It's a great question. I think what you need somebody who will tell you the truth, who will help you swim against the you're marvelous current that a lot of famous people can just sort of coast on, being told by people around them what they're doing is right. A very interesting woman who I interviewed for a story on congestion pricing in New York, but she's an extraordinary woman and has really had the ear of the last 4 or 5 mayors of New York, said about Rudy Giuliani, I'd never heard this, and I'm going to forget the name, but she said, people have all sorts of theories about what happened to him, including alcohol abuse. But she said the real thing is that his best friend that he went to high school with, who was there for him every step of the way, died. And she said that Rudy was at his bedside for like constantly, and that she says that when he died, when this best friend died, that's when the slide began. And it made it. I thought it was really, really. And I can't remember who. I'm sure we could do a quick Google search, but who this friend was. That this was the person that he listened to more than anyone. So I think having someone. There's a group of people in the book, in a section called "It's About Time." People who received recognition late in life. They didn't necessarily achieve great things late in life, but at the very end of their lives, while they were still around, received recognition. They all three have in common. Tyrus Wong, who created the look for Bambi. Carmen Herrera, abstract expressionist, who did her first solo show at a major museum when she was 101. And John Goodenough, the 97-year-old Nobel laureate, who was a co-inventor of the lithium-ion battery. All of them had marriages at around, that lasted around 60 years. And that's what sustained them.
That's and yes, I thought with the lithium battery, I didn't know any about that. How at that age, what I wasn't clear of is, did he start patenting that for a while and it just kicked in, or he got the Nobel then, or
he got the Nobel much later?
Yeah.
But there's a reason you don't know his name, because he wasn't a showboater at all. He continued teaching, and the technology, I believe he patented it. But he allowed it, I'm going to get, my jargon's a little squishy here, but open source, I guess he shared it basically. So he could have become extraordinarily wealthy off of his discoveries, and that didn't happen. So just a really generous person.
You work at the Henry Ford up in Dearborn, Michigan. Have any of you gone to the museum there? It's remarkable.
It's great. It's great.
Really go if you get a chance. But it deals with innovation some. When you were there or doing your programming, CBS or ever there, did you start hunting for people that did things later in life there, like here, or I'm just wondering, how did you learn about it? Yeah. I've never heard of the lithium battery winning a Nobel.
Sure. One of the curators there gave us the idea for Sam and Betsy Barber, who they had done very, very well, and they were retiring basically to the south of France when they were in their 50s, I think. I think Sam was a little bit older, and Betsy was trying to make an apple tart, but she was arthritic, and the peeler wasn't working well. And so together at that age, they, working with the designer, created the OXO Good Grip peeler. And so they became pioneers in universal design. And that was another sort of viewing an ending as a beginning. Because they could have hired somebody to make the apple tart, right?
Right.
And so she said, I want to make this. And there was only specialized kitchen utensils for people with arthritis. And they said, no, let's make something that everyone can use. And I'd much rather use that. Those utensils are great.
In our time remaining, I did want to touch on, because I do like the idea of activism when you get older, getting involved with an issue or issues, volunteering, making a difference. Mary Church Terrell, a leader of the early NAACP, an incredible civil rights career. Who is she, and why did she make your book?
Well, early on, I really wanted, when I think of the civil rights era, which you've written so much about, and I thought I always associate it with young, brave activists. John Lewis at 25, leading the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is 34 with the I Have a Dream speech. But I thought there have to be older activists. And you and I have had conversations about this. And so our researcher, fantastic researcher, said, what about this woman? Her portrait hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. Her name is Mary Church Terrell, sometimes pronounced Terrell. And she led sit-ins at a Washington, D.C. lunch counter when she was 86. And immediately what I thought is, somebody at that age doing that, at best, is going to live in the world they help make better for a couple of years, a few years. They're not doing it for themselves. This is truly a selfless act. It's for your literal and figurative children that you're doing this. There's something so powerful about an older person putting their butt on the line like that. And this is a woman, a very sophisticated woman. She was born 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, an early activist against the brutal practice of lynching. She had gone to the White House with Frederick Douglass to petition President Benjamin Harrison. In her middle age, as you point out, she was a co-founder of the NAACP. She had earned her rest. But when she was rejected by the American Association of University Women simply for being black, she was one of the first black women to have a higher degree, hers from Oberlin, she was so fired up that she rejoined the battle. And she led these sit-ins. She had to go to Thompson's Restaurant in Washington, D.C., right, the citadel of democracy. Washington, D.C.'s public accommodations were still segregated, illegally, incidentally, because there were statutes on the book from Reconstruction that mandated the integration, but they were completely ignored. But she went 4 times, was rejected every time, but sat there anyway, not being served. And it went eventually to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the integration of public accommodations, and she lived to see it. She died a few months later.
Yes, and I was Rosa Parks' biographer, and out of all the times I spent with her, the most interesting was she lived up in Detroit in a condominium overlooking the Detroit River at Windsor, and she did 2 things in her senior years. One was take students to see Underground Railroad sites. Pretty amazing.
Wow.
And in Cincinnati is our National Underground Railroad Museum. That's you should go to if you get to Cincinnati. But the big thing that she did in her senior years, she thought there was a divide about emailing and technology with the older generation in assisted living and kids in middle school. So they formed with teachers, students would meet somebody, and just like talking to your mom, they would get to know each other, but the student would teach the senior technology, how to use their phone, how to do that. And then the older person would tell the younger person stories of history or past times and things as a way of cross-generational sharing.
That's can I just say something about Rosa Parks? There was a documentary, right, towards the end of her life.
Yep.
And was Spike Lee involved in it?
No.
Okay, but I remember. So not to sound weird here, but I remember that it was either the Oscars or actually maybe it was the Golden Globes. I think it was the Oscars. And I was watching the red carpet on E! Channel, and Rosa Parks came in, and I think she was escorted by Spike Lee, and the entertainment reporter. It was such an awkward moment, and I just, to this day, am so grateful that she didn't say, "Who are you wearing?" Like, it just would have been so inappropriate, because they spent the whole day saying, "Who did your manicure?" and all that, and it's like Rosa Parks walks in. So.
Yeah, well, people with Rosa Parks people talk about the AME Church, the Freedom Church, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, on, and Rosa Parks was part of that. But she went to Japan and adopted Buddhism too. She became Christian Buddhist, and people don't know that side of her. And but at one point I talked to her, she said, "Oh, Dr. King really believed the nonviolent stuff. He was out there on nonviolence." I was like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, look, when somebody would slap Martin, which happened, he turned the other cheek, and then again and again." Yeah. And she said, "If somebody slaps me, I punch them back." Sure. And this was in her 80s, she said that.
And that bus.
But she watched Martin do that. Even on stage, a guy didn't hit him, and he got stabbed. And she just said, "You can't get abused like that."
No. And that bus is at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn.
I think that was my conduit point. I love the idea of looking at rock and roll musicians we like getting older. We mentioned, Willie is so great. I mentioned Bob Dylan, who's so amazing. But you have one in the book that I think gets underrated some, because I saw him in concert, John Fogerty.
Sure.
Because he still puts on a show. You go see Fogerty, those songs are undeniable. Proud Mary, or they're undeniable. Lodi, they're just great.
It ain't me. I mean, they're so down on the corner. I mean, so many great songs. And I think that John Fogerty, part of the issue there was legal wrangling, right, over the writing. And so he had this unintentional hiatus for a long time, right? But he's so vital. I have not seen him in concert. I would love to. I've seen tape, but.
Do you need to? Do you think others have to help you when you're in that third act? Like you mentioned a spouse, who's devoted for decades, or a friend, or a parent that's surviving. But what about just for somebody who had a great 20s, like a rock and roll star,
sure, and
now they're in their 70s or 80s, and they don't look like the 20-year-old rock star? Because the writer-novelist Jack Kerouac wrote the On the Road and the Dharma Bums, and kids used to come wearing these like leather jackets that said On the Road, Dharma Bums, and bang on his door in Florida, and he'd answer and he'd pretend it wasn't him. Not because he wanted to be rude, but he didn't want them to be disappointed that he was bloated or overage. He wanted them to have that, James Dean, youth feel. So I'm just wondering, how does one need to look younger all the time to feel, we're in an era where people want to do plastic surgery, or look youth? What's your feel on all?
Well, first of all, my hope is that not having plastic surgery will be the thing to do. Because the thing is that I do feel like everyone in Hollywood has the same teeth at this point. And I just don't know how they're going to be identified later. I mean, like, they all have this, and it's a little hypocritical for me to say, because I'm wearing Invisalign now. And let me tell you that the reason, I can't, my pants keep falling down, because what they don't tell you is if you get Invisalign, you will immediately lose weight, because you can't snack and graze anymore. It's like Ozempic that makes your teeth straight. It really is. It's like, but I think that this is sort of a non-answer. I think you have to will yourself, if you still care about what other people think, not to care. Sometimes a dramatic event can do it. Very briefly in the book, architects. It's really fascinating how many architects peak in their 80s and sometimes later. And Yasmin Lari, the first female professional architect in Pakistan, did what I think a lot of lawyers I've experienced do, which is they spend the middle of their career going, once I attain this level of success, I'm going to give back. And something doesn't allow them to do it. And I don't think it's greed. I think it's fear. This is, I'm not going to do this thing that I know would make me feel more fulfilled. And for her, she kept saying, I'm gonna give back to the Pakistani people. And it was the Kashmir earthquake in 2005 that killed 80,000 people and displaced many more families that kind of pushed her out of this mindset and made her go, you know what? I'm just going to be all about sustainable housing, traditional methods of architecture that can endure climate change. And she did it and is happier than she's ever been than she was as a starchitect, where she was sort of surrounded by a lot of yes people and was really uncompromising. So
that's a starchitect?
A starchitect, yeah.
I never heard that phrase.
I don't think that spell check recognizes that. So.
What about my friend Frank? We're going to have to, two quick things, very quickly. I just adore Frank Lloyd Wright. What did you find out about Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, what I found out about Frank Lloyd Wright is, he had been on the cover of Time magazine for Falling Water by the middle of his career. He was obviously such a big deal. Although I will tell you that when I've toured Falling Water, I just wanted to keep going to the bathroom. And so I would never want to live there because you just hear water all the time. And it would make me crazy. And also he didn't want any window shades. And I'm like, I don't get up with natural light. Like I need blackout curtains. And so that wasn't
they leak.
for me.
A lot of us houses are leaky.
It's very leaky too.
Yeah.
The maintenance is crazy.
Yeah, but I still love them so much.
So, But when he was 84, he submitted his first design for the Guggenheim Museum. And I did not realize how much pushback there was from so many of the great artists of the time who believed, somewhat understandably, that the building was about the building and not about their art. But he persevered at that late age. He wasn't alive to see it finished, but it's as much a part of New York architecture and landscape as Falling Water is in West.
Yeah, that's a Midwesterner, a Wisconsin guy going into New York, dealing with all the zoning laws, building laws, and was able to get the Guggenheim up, and it's one of the great buildings in America.
And it absolutely is. And when you talk about Frank Lloyd Wright going into New York, it's like I.M. Pei going to Paris.
Yes.
Right, at the age of 75, saying, we're going to take this 800-year-old palace and I'm going to put a glass pyramid in the middle of it.
Right.
And the French heads exploding everywhere that this guy would do.
I would be remiss, and we are out of time, if I didn't end with, I had a tortoise growing up. That was my pet, Tortuga. And I used to look at that tortoise pet because how old they would get in the rain. And I always loved looking at redwood trees and the rains and all that. But you have Mr. Pickles the tortoise. What is Mr. Pickles?
Well, Mr. Pickles, it's just so fabulous. Mr. Pickles the tortoise, who's from Houston, or he's not from, he lives in Houston now. But Mr. Pickles the tortoise was a bachelor, had not had children until he was 90. And then I don't know if she's Mrs. Pickles. I don't know the status of the relationship, but sired 3 children. Their names Dill, Gherkin, and Jalapeno. And they had 3 kids. And I just think it's fabulous. I'm so excited. And we thought that Al Pacino was impressive having a kid at 83. And Mr. Pickles is expected to live until 150. And so I think he could just keep having kids and become the Nick Cannon of tortoises. I mean, like,
Mo Rocca. We love you, Mo.
Thank you, Doug.